So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our ATS webinar on the research integrity in medical education, lessons from the Tuskegee experiment. My name is Hugo Carmona. I'll be one of our hosts. I'm from the University of Washington, and I'll ask my co-host to introduce themselves, please.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. My name is Christine Bojanowski. I'm an assistant professor at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Very excited to be here with you all.
Thank you, Christine. Okay. And in a moment, I'll be introducing our panelists. But as you can see, we have a great set of panelists here with Drs. Martin Tobin, Nitin Seam, and Aaron Baugh. I just want to take a moment to thank all of the people who worked really hard to put this webinar together. Thank you. This has really been a collaborative effort from the ATS Health and Equity Diversity Committee, the ATS MIT, the Members in Training and Transition, and the ATS Training Committee. Thank you to everyone who has put so much effort, and thank you all for participating and joining in our discussion today. I was going to give us, I hope that folks have had a chance to read Dr. Tobin's kind of 50th anniversary remarks around the Tuskegee, the revealing of the Tuskegee experiment, and or had a chance to watch his ATS panel. But for those folks who may have missed that, I was going to give just a brief couple of minutes context for our conversation today, and then pass it over, introduce our panelists, and then pass it over to Christine to give us more setup there. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of the uncovering of the Tuskegee syphilis study, when the public learned that the Public Health Service, which is the precursor of the CDC, had run a 40-year unethical experiment against African-American men by withholding what was already a known to be effective therapy for life-threatening disease. As Dr. Tobin recaps the history of these and the subsequent experiments in Guatemala, as well as the failures of leadership and of a community of scientists and non-scientists to really stand up against this brutality. I highly recommend reading the original paper and or at least watching his plenary from ATS 2020 on the subject. But again, I'll just briefly summarize a few key points from that. So as I mentioned, the experiment was run from 1932 to 1972 for the sole purpose of documenting the natural history of untreated syphilis. And to be clear, these experiments were done at a time when there was already a known proven effective treatment for syphilis. It was widely known. In fact, another study, even earlier, called the Oslo study, had ended early when an effective treatment came to market. The study was conducted in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population was African-American. The study included a population of exclusively Black men, 600 participants, 399 of which had syphilis and 201 served as controls. Generally poor, the men agreed to participate because the investigators offered them what they thought was free medical care and burial insurance. No consent was obtained, and the men were often deceived and outright lied to regarding the purpose of certain diagnostic tests, being told instead that they were treatment. As you'll read in the paper, over 37 years, 15 papers were published on the results of these experiments, including in very widely read journals. So as Dr. Tobin notes, the experiment and the results were not hidden. They were out in the open. And yet over that period of time, no physician or scientist seems to have published a letter or commentary criticizing the ethics of the experiment. And it wasn't until Peter Buxton, a psychiatric social worker, was hired to interview the men in 1965. Did someone speak out? Peter Buxton found grave moral concern with the study and challenged what at that point was the CDC. And after being negated by them, ultimately broke the story to the journalists from the Washington Star and the New York Times. So that's the context in which we'll be discussing some of our discussion today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers and then get going. So first off, we have Dr. Martin Tobin, who is a professor of medicine at Loyola University Stritch School of Medicine. He graduated from medical school at University College Dublin before training in internal medicine in Ireland, a research fellowship at King's College Hospital in London, and then residency and fellowship training at Mount Sinai Medical Center, the University of Miami and University of Pittsburgh. And while his list of accomplishments is extensive, to say the least, we just like to highlight that he is a former editor-in-chief of the Blue Journal, and he is, as quote unquote, supreme scholar of critical care medicine, as was described by a former editor-in-chief of the Blue Journal, with greater than 150 peer-reviewed papers and many important textbooks in pulmonary and critical care. Our next panelist is Dr. Nitin Seam, who is a clinical professor of medicine at George Washington University, as well as the associate chief and fellowship director of the NIH Clinical Center Critical Care Medicine Department. He graduated from George Washington University School of Medicine and continued his internal medicine training there before completing fellowship training in critical care medicine at the NIH and pulmonary and sleep fellowship at GW. He is the editor-in-chief of ATS Scholar. His research interests include mechanical ventilation and ARDS, as well as the appropriate use of innovative technologies in medical education. And we have here Dr. Aaron Baugh, who is an assistant professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. He graduated from the University of Toledo College of Medicine and completed both internal medicine residency and chief residency there before going on to complete a pulmonary and critical care fellowship at UCSF. And his research interests include the role of racial disparities in respiratory health outcomes. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Bojanowski.
Thank you. So it goes without saying we have an incredible panel here. And so we're really excited to have these wonderful physicians here speaking with us today. But the point of this, even though it is a larger group, is to try to really foster and promote discussion. It's a difficult topic. It's a sensitive topic. It is just something that we really wanted to encourage more open discourse about. So that being said, what I encourage everyone to do, if you are comfortable doing this, please go ahead and turn your screen on. We're going to be using kind of the panel view and have this be promoted as more of a discussion-based session today. If you're not comfortable, that's completely fine, but we'd love to see your faces. It really makes things a little bit more interactive. Also on the chat side, please feel free at any point to type in any questions, any discussion points, anything that you'd like to bring up, and I can share it directly with our panelists. If you prefer to ask a question anonymously, please direct message me and I will give those questions again to our panel in an anonymous format. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question, please just direct message me so we can coordinate that together. And we will go from there. I'm really looking forward to the next hour together.
Great. So I'd like to start off one of our questions, thinking through our context of the experiments in today's time and thinking about the pitfalls of science today. And I was hoping our panelists might start off by discussing, can we make any comment about the science of Tuskegee and about how racism in science might propagate beliefs around racial differences as biological differences, as opposed to social determinants of health, how that might play into the role of participation in clinical trials and education research. What does that look like for minority populations in the US and barriers to increasing their participation in research?
Regarding the science, one thing to point out is when the Tuskegee study was begun in 1932, the science was really cutting edge because this was conducted in the context of eugenics. And eugenics was at the cutting edge of science at that time. Today, we look back at eugenics and we know that eugenics subsequently led to the Nazi mindset. But that was not recognized in 1932. And even after the Second World War, there were still people thinking that eugenics was a very important area to be conducting research. So it's clearly this was not, at a low level of science. It was at the very highest level of science, just in terms of the scientific aspect of your question.
Mm-hmm. I will comment in additionally on this, the point you raised about what is the connection between, public racism or prejudice and science as it conducted, and I think it's kind of bi-directional there. On the one hand, as Dr. Tobin is sharing, this was a study that was founded in eugenics. And if you look at some of the senior researchers, they were interested in exploring this idea about whether neurosyphilis had a different, propensity across races that they felt might be related to the different level of neural development across races. And this was, of course, based in these much older ideas about, non-whites are, less intelligent or less cultured, less sophisticated, and giving this really a biological sheen. And there we see, public ideas of prejudice and discrimination filtering into the way these people shape their scientific questions. Going the other directions, you will see repeatedly, if you look at early debates, whether in the United States, in Nazi Germany, and South Africa, about what is the defense of inequity or unjust law systems that kind of divide people into first and second class citizens, or even in a more present day contemporary context, just what is the defense of the systems that we have that are not unfair in purpose but unfair in effect. And a lot of the question is, well, would these people, whoever is disadvantaged, would they have ended up so poorly regardless of what we did, right? Is this a consequence of nature, right, rather than our society? And they often point to studies of this kind or other studies where, scientists are saying there could be differences by race. This could just be a natural difference. It's not that we don't have a good social safety net. It's that, this group of people would have been poor all along because, they're scientifically different than us. And so those are the two directions that I see things happening.
Yeah. So I hear you saying, Dr. Baugh, a lot about the kind of justification for racism in a kind of scientific platform. And just thinking through, the pitfalls of science today, how do you all see that as an issue today, as opposed to, what Dr. Tobin was said, which is, in retrospect, that scientific community was wrong in their viewpoint, but what are the pitfalls today that we might be falling into in the same kind of realm?
One of the very instructive studies, is when AZT was introduced for the treatment of pregnant women with HIV infection, and that's very recently. And again, these studies were conducted in African women. And it was, again, they believed, this was the NIH, this is recently, and the Nobel laureate Harold Varmus was part of this because he was the director of the NIH at the time, and they believed that it was totally fine to withhold treatment from African women because they wouldn't have been able to afford that therapy. So therefore, they're not being denied anything. So you can always come in you can justify to yourself that there's good reasons why to deny therapy to disadvantaged groups. For all of these groups, the key common denominator is that they are vulnerable. And so once you have vulnerable people, unfortunately, physicians don't appear to have any great reluctance in taking advantage of their vulnerability. And that this is, and I don't believe that will go away.
Howard Saff from our group of participants also just wanted to add in the comment, reminding everyone to think of the Hippocratic Oath and reminding that the Hippocratic Oath applies to all human beings and not allowing anyone to be considered less than or less than you. And so he was bringing up the idea of a safety checklist tool and how that, keeping us in check and reminding us of our Hippocratic Oath and how that seems to have been forgotten over the course in our history.
I think that's tremendously important. I also think that as a general lesson for myself in all this is that, the responsibility that physicians have to communicate with the public what is the meaning of their work and the correct interpretation, right? People are like, it's tempting to like, operate only in our conferences and only, among peers, right? But people are, access, especially in the internet age, right? Accessing our work, interpreting in it, extrapolating from it, whether we are, blessing those interpretations or not. And so, raising your voice to say, this is what we are actually trying to accomplish. This is what the meaning of this is. This is what the meaning is not, is an important exercise, and also allows you to stay in dialogue with some of those communities that might be able to give you pushback on things that you might be blind to, or you might have gone along with, right? But they can challenge you on that and say, like, this doesn't make sense to me, and help you to reconsider.
Great. Dr.
Yeah, I was going to chime in about actually Dr. Saf's comment as well. I think, one of the things that, again, I encourage everyone to listen to watch Dr. Tobin's lecture, as well as read the paper, because it really provided such a nice context in a way that I haven't read or seen described about Tuskegee. And I think, going back to Dr. Saf's comment, providing some guardrails, some structure, having a safety checklist tool, making sure that there is some structure to making sure that that it's not going to be lost to history is important. I think in the lecture, Dr. Tobin talked about that this led to mandating IRBs and informed consent in the early 70s. But I didn't know, and Dr. Tobin pointed out that in 1907, Osler wrote that full consent was necessary for human experimentation in a medical journal. So these weren't new concepts to researchers. They were just mandated in the 1970s to improve the guardrails and provide more checks in the system. So I think that's beneficial, but we really can't lose touch with history and remembering this. And that's what I think was so wonderful about the paper and the video, is to really contextualize this for people who, like myself, who didn't know this history well.
Yeah. A lot of what you all have mentioned is really around this idea of empathy and having empathy for others, and that loss of empathy kind of helps separate when some folks do things and don't have a consideration for the effects on others. Just thinking off that, and again of this idea of kind of racism in science, how do we start to address that? Thinking through lower levels of participation among minority patients in clinical trials, about minority or non-dominant populations of investigators leading these trials. How do we start to address all of these issues to help maybe with that idea that Dr. Baugh was bringing people together who have different perspectives, have different viewpoint, and allow us to build that empathy with each other?
I would see those as quite different. I believe that you need empathy. And the word I would use is moral imagination, because the word empathy is a Latin term that people can get lost in. Basically, it is for you to put yourself in the shoes of the unfortunate person. Because I believe that if you were to think of the stuff that was done in Tuskegee or was done with the HIV, AZT, and you say, would you do this to your brother or to your sister? None of us would have to spend a moment in knowing how to answer that question. So that, in terms of the empathy factor is that element. Then separate from that is what how you approach research and science in different groups. And obviously in knowing how to extrapolate from studies, if all the studies are done in just white men, you're going to have a problem. So clearly it's obvious that you need of diverse populations, but these I think should be kept separate from the question of moral imagination. These are two different things.
Would you mind actually, Dr. Tobin, just going over what moral imagination is for the group, for people that weren't able to, that aren't familiar with that term?
Yeah, it is part of the problem is that when we look at the Tuskegee, it's very easy to look at the bad guys. And we look and we see, you know, what did John Cutler do in Guatemala, but he was part of Tuskegee as well. And we all would say, oh my God, there's no way I would ever be in that situation. I couldn't possibly become John Cutler. And, you know, Raymond Vandelier before that, who became the director of the CDC subsequently. So these are extremely accomplished people. But the thing is, those people never looked at the people they're doing the experiments on as somebody out of their family. And moral imagination is simply putting yourself in the same shoes as the person you're doing the experiment on. And, you know, and that's very important because, I mean, I feel very strongly about doing research on humans. I've spent the last 40 years sticking down esophageal balloons and zapping people with electrical stimuli to their phrenic nerve and whatever else and putting them through the mill. But you have to, you know, you have to level with them ahead of time and say to them, there's no gain for you in this stuff. You know, we're trying to get information that'll help other patients. But you have, you know, most of all the experiments I've done them on myself first. So, I mean, I've swallowed unending numbers of balloons and I've been stimulated in every possible area, you know. And so, but it's important that you're not doing, it's easy to talk about the Hippocratic Oath. Don't do unto others, you know, what you won't have done to yourself, or don't do any harm. The problem is, the Hippocratic Oath is vital, but it's extraordinarily hard to live up to. We all know it. It becomes, you know, kind of a banality because it's so often repeated. But it's vital and it's very hard to live up to. And it's connected in with moral imagination, where you're placing yourself in the shoes of the patient or the experimental subject.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question from the audience. So William Roche, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, but wanted to just share his thoughts on the effects of Tuskegee and how it's trickled down to what we've seen recently in COVID-19. So he shared, Tuskegee has had an effect during the current pandemic with the COVID-19 vaccine. During the pandemic, racial and ethnic minority groups have been disproportionately affected by the virus with low rates of trial participation. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, accounted for 21% of COVID-related deaths, and had only a 3% vaccine clinical trial enrollment. The mistrust from Tuskegee is cited for the main reason for the low acceptance rate of the vaccine by the African American community. According to CDC, African Americans have the lowest fully vaccinated rate as well. So before I move on to the question, are there any follow-up comments to that anyone wanted to share? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a good and important point to talk about. Thank you so much, Dr. Roche, for that. Is understanding what is the role or what is the legacy of Tuskegee, especially with skepticism of minority populations to participate in research and trust in the medical profession. I would say it definitely does play a role. And we have studies of that not only from COVID-19, which you have so excellently cited, but also from the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the early 90s, that this does play a role. However, the one caveat I would give to that is that levels of mistrust in the medical profession among the African American community was high even before the start or certainly before the revelation of the Tuskegee study, and even before the start of the Tuskegee study, right? And similarly, yes, while there's this legacy of Tuskegee and many other unethical projects, there's whole books written on it. American Apartheid is one, on the systematic mistreatment of African Americans by the American healthcare system. These continue to have relevance and continue to be sustained and have power today, because in the present day, patients report high levels of, feeling like they were mistreated or having perceived discrimination in their day-to-day encounters with the medical system. If we talk about ourselves as physician scientists, and then we admit that as physicians, we're not treating all populations equitably, how then will they trust us as scientists if they can't trust us as physicians first, right? And so these are, things I think that also need to be addressed. While we also acknowledge the historical legacy of Tuskegee, can we correct even just these present day mistreatment inequities?
Thank you, Aaron. Harold Collard posed a question, which I'd like to direct to Dr. Seam first, Nitin. Harold asks, I'm interested in the panel's perspective on the lessons of Tuskegee for academic institutions, so schools, campus leaders, in protecting vulnerable populations and improving disparities in research. What should institutions be doing that they are not?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's the heart of the question. I don't have a clean answer to that, but I can walk through my initial thoughts. I think we must to learn from history and not to repeat it. We have to be taught effectively, and I'm afraid that us as physicians, we haven't been taught the lessons of Tuskegee well enough. So, I'm really glad that Dr. Tobin wrote the paper, as only he can. The Blue Journal published it. There was the presentation at YouTube, the presentation at ATS, and then that was recorded and posted on YouTube. But I was actually even looking at that today, and I saw there was about 8,000 views of the article, and only 1,200 people had watched it on YouTube. And you think of the random videos you'll see on YouTube with millions of views. So I think we have to do a better job of having a collective understanding, a shared understanding of Tuskegee to really learn from it. What we see here is not enough. We should all be sharing the video of this, of Dr. Tobin's lecture plenary with our trainees. And we have to have conversations like we're having today, but at a local level. But of course, we have to build on that with a meaningful educational approach. I know there are many people doing important work in this area regarding equitable treatment of non-majority participants. It's not my particular area of expertise, so I'll defer to others if they have comment. But I think one of the important aspects I can speak to is we also need platforms to share and disseminate the output of that work. And the opportunities for the people who put that time and effort and devote their careers into such work receive scholarly credit. So, journals like our journal at ATS Scholar, we've sought papers about diversity, equity, inclusion. MedEd Portal has a collection of this of content, and so people can share that. So I think that's a step in the right direction, and it's a way for people to share resources as they're trying to train at a local level.
Right. Just thinking through what you all have said, and then thinking about, really our trainees, right? Kind of as folks in the chat mentioned about thinking how are we preparing our current generation for the future? What are the institutions doing now for the future? Thinking about our trainees in their current research participants, as future clinical trial and other research investigators. Dr. Tobin, in the paper, one of the misconceptions that Dr. Tobin brought up was this idea that the field investigator role was not an important contributor to propagating atrocities at the event. We all focus, as Dr. Tobin mentioned earlier, on the leaders of an unethical study, like Dr. Cutler and others from there. But how does this role of the field investigator, play? Because that's the role our trainees often are. They're participants in a larger study that they themselves may not be managing or running, and yet it may ultimately be a research study that has an unethical component to it. What advice do we have for them to avoid falling into these same traps of propagating what is otherwise wrong, unethical, or something that should be changed?
I think that's probably the crucial part for this particular webinar, because you're aiming for young people. And if you look at Walter Edmondson, Dr. Walter Edmondson, that appears in more photographs in my article than any other person, And I mean, I've been in the shoes of Walter Edmondson at repeated stages throughout my life, where you're participating in a study and you have to ask yourself, is this really the right thing? Because it's extremely easy to be corralled in like Dr. Walter Edmondson, and want to participate in research. There's people who will want you to participate in research. And clearly, if you look at it in the Tuskegee study, you have the people who initiated it, but it goes on for 40 years. So it's far more dependent on the Walter Edmondsons than it is in the people who started it. And, I mean, you look at the photographs of these doctors in the 50s, all of them knew that they were denying penicillin to these patients. This was extremely clear to them, and they saw no problem in withholding penicillin that had been out at this stage for 6 or 8 years. And they were refusing, or even to inform the patient, that they were being denied a life-saving therapy. And so the problem is for young people, how do they make sure that that doesn't happen to them?
There are two comments from the chat that do kind of apply here and ask for, or kind of plead to for each of us to do a bit of a gut check, right? So Tanya von Visker mentions or comments and challenges everyone. Is it possible that microaggression sentiments and superiority sentiments of any kind lead us all astray in justifying and rationalizing? We need to be aware of our own underneath feelings. And then Donna Upson actually calls out to everyone that not only, she doesn't directly comment on just passively assenting and participating, but actually being more proactive and being an advocate. And it's our duty also to advocate. So she says, we also have a unique opportunity to speak up and advocate for vulnerable people in other spheres. She cites the tobacco industry targeting vulnerable people for decades, fossil fuel industry with disparate impacts on air quality. She says physicians' voices are heard and respected. Advocacy efforts often are not recognized or supported in our academic institutions. Any comments about that last statement in particular about advocacy efforts not being widely supported?
Yeah, if I may, I think it does tie into kind of what Dr. Tobin was saying, and I think Don's point is an important one. When you go back to the point that Dr. Tobin made in his lecture about Peter Buxton, right, having so little education compared to all these numerous physicians who were part of Tuskegee, but the moral imagination, that ability to walk in the endangered individual shoes, isn't linked to conventional education. But we have to create cultures, right, of advocacy, to say, we want to empower trainees. If you see something that you believe is inappropriate, that you say that, as opposed to a hierarchical culture where you are supposed to just follow the lead. And I think that's a simple thing we can do and we can work on even at our individual institutions. So they are empowered to speak up, so their character and conscience can shine through, and their individual actions can identify the wrong and what is being done and help change it. So I really do, I think what Donna said really resonates with.
I just really love this conversation that's going on in the chat. For me, it connects to, as Dr. Tobin was saying, it's tempting to look at just the villains, but if we, talk about people that are in more of these middle positions, I'd like to introduce to everyone this example of Paul Cornman. Now, Paul Cornman, for those that don't know, was a former president of the American Public Health Association in 1970. He helped coordinate the medical response and provisions for Martin Luther King's March on Washington. So very much a person committed to health equity, to servicing equal rights and civil rights for African Americans. Helped lead the campaigns to integrate hospitals to non-white staff and faculty. But when he was asked about his whole reaction to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, his comment was, I knew exactly what it was. But I feel a lot of guilt over it in retrospect. But at the time, I saw it as an academician, so I didn't see any problem with it. And I think that points out a powerful thing of, when we look at moral imagination, what are the things that help us to expand that? And what are the things that help us to, discourage it or shrink it? Now, Dr. Carew is saying that in her training, she never heard about advocacy as being a powerful part, or, as being an essential part of her role as a physician. And I didn't either. I, in fact, heard things like, when you put your white coat on, don't think about yourself as a woman anymore. Don't think about yourself as a minority, whatever. Like you are only this thing, this, doctor, this physician or academic identity, right? And how this separates us from, values that we otherwise have, from, moral conscience that we've otherwise developed. How we learn not to look at things, as Tanya Van Visker was saying, like we have to look at, do I have, is there a possible, unconscious bias or prejudice at work? If you tell people that, when you are a physician, you're automatically beyond all these things, or when you're a researcher, you don't have to care about these things, it makes it much more likely to happen because you stop challenging yourself. You stop thinking, right? And so how do we get people to say, yes, we do have this Hippocratic Oath. We do want to treat people, equitably, but it's not a given. It is a daily challenge that we have to push ourselves. We have to recognize, we could not be doing the right thing. We could be taking advantage of a vulnerable population. And how can we not then, as Paul Cornley said, look at things as an academician, but look at things as, the other Paul Cornley, the great civil rights advocate, the healthcare leader that helped us achieve greater equity rather than silence and failure to recognize a real crime of the 20th century.
It strikes me also that there are a lot of educators in the audience as well. So I have a question for the panelists that I hope our educators will also join in on, which is, and this is a challenging question, but are there things about our system, about our education system, both kind of medical education or research education system, that, to add to Dr. Baugh's point, help propagate this kind of lack of self-questioning, of pushing ourselves to be asking ourselves, how is this impacting others? How is this being viewed by others? How am I falling into this trap, as Dr. Tobin mentions, of being Walter Edmondson and all these others? Are there things about our system that are contributing to this? And if so, certainly we're always trying to improve our big community and small community kind of systems. So what do we do about that?
I thought a lot about this actually since reading the paper, and actually the shock is a friend of mine. I echo her comment. I did not learn this when I was a medical student, resident, or a fellow. I think that's part of it, right? As educators, we need to look at how we design our curricula. We are teaching procedures like bronchoscopy, right? Respiratory physiology, mechanical ventilation, your fund of knowledge in medicine. But we don't talk about concepts such as moral imagination. And I think it actually goes back to Dr. Baugh's point about, trying to put yourself in those academic shoes. But at the end of the day, we are clinicians who are seeing patients, and part of our role is to protect those endangered patients. We're participating in human research. So I think introducing those concepts and emphasizing these concepts and teaching them has to be part of what we do going forward. Again, that goes back to culture, making it much easier to empower somebody. If these aren't foreign concepts and these are things they're used to, they've been taught at multiple levels through their health professions education.
That's awesome. I wanted to share a couple of comments related to the environment of medical education. The first is from Shefali Soni, who's a medical student. So she shares, as a medical student, it's very powerful to hear your mentors and professors talk about examples of injustice in their practice and research. increasing the amount of discussion early in training, as you were just kind of alluding to, Nitin, is a key to growing the skill, training the muscle of minimizing microaggressions and implicit bias. So I thought that was a really insightful comment. Laura Brady also shares with everyone, talking about how there are established research methods for ensuring and valuing communication and feedback within the community that you want to study. So community-based participatory research, community advisory boards. And then she also says, and of course, more diversity and representation in academia all around and healthcare. So those are two pretty impactful tools that were mentioned.
Great, yeah. And then from Nitin, if I could ask from a kind of journal perspective, and Dr. Tobin as well, as kind of both current, former editors of journals, where does that play into this conversation, particularly as our trainees are thinking of kinds of research they're submitting, of the content of that research, as Dr. Brady was just mentioning, how are from the kind of top-down version, are we helping create that voice of community participation in research design and review of our papers, things like that?
It's a really interesting and important discussion. Another thing I learned from Dr. Tobin's lecture were that there were 14 journal articles published over 40 years related to Tuskegee. And as he pointed out, it wasn't subtle. The titles of the papers would say "Untreated Syphilis." Like that should be enough to arouse suspicion. Especially, like I said, it's clear as you're getting into, this is from the 1930s to the 1970s. So, as a journal editor, it's really hard for me to fathom. We spent so much time in looking at p-values, how statistics are reported, and so forth. I'm just stunned at how this happened over and over again over all these years. And just to provide some context, how we do peer review, right? Like we get the papers as journal editors. Now there are the guardrails I mentioned, IRB approval or exemption, and if an original research paper doesn't have that, they're rejected. But if it doesn't, peer reviewers read the articles and provide comments. Associate editors and editors have also read the articles. They look at the peer reviewer comments and they make decisions on the appropriateness of publication. And so, I understand it was pre-IRB, but I can't believe the number of publications over that long period of time across multiple journals related to Tuskegee. But I would like to think that increase, I think it's been mentioned in the chat, and I agree 100%. I think a lot of us who are in leadership position in journals are very focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, thinking having increased diversity in peer review and in editorial leadership would be very helpful, and is helpful, right, in arousing suspicion about inappropriate, unethical research, getting more people who are able to put themselves in the endangered patient's shoes, I think is critically important.
I'm afraid I'd like to come in with a bit of a damper in these wishful thinkings. As an editor, I spent 10 years as an associate editor, 5 years as editor-in-chief. And in terms, because peer review is a very subjective thing in terms of the referee that looks at a paper. And the Tuskegee is startling to see over this period of time. The last paper that is published from the Tuskegee is after the New York Times broke the story. So this came in fully recognized that all of what happened in Tuskegee, clearly the reviewers weren't troubled, nor was the editor. Also, the editor of major American journals were still recruiting the Tuskegee authors to write review articles, not only on syphilis, but also on AIDS after it came. Say they believed that the people who did the Tuskegee experiments were really the authorities in this area. So this was decades after the Tuskegee study. So I don't believe any checklists. I don't believe the makeup of the groups of editors or or reviewers are going to cure something like this. This is a matter of conscience. This is something you have to look into your own soul, and you will not find that on a checklist. All the little rules and all the rest of it are not going to capture it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to let that sit for a moment. Just thinking through that, yeah, it's really a community-based thing. It's a personal-based thing as much as it is anything a system-based issue.
I think it's much more, as you say it exactly, it's a personal thing. The problem is that once you start thinking in terms of groups, you ignore your own personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's.
And looks like there's, I'm going to let Christine, you process those comments here for a moment, but I love all these comments that are coming.
It's hard for me not to just want to continue to engage on side conversations, but just to echo. So Marianne Green was talking about just the biggest systemic impacts overall that we're facing is the lack of diversity at all levels. And talking about how the upcoming Supreme Court decision has the potential to do significant harm to the progress we have made. So that's really talking about that bigger systemic systems that we find ourselves working in and trying to challenge ourselves through. And then Peter Sporn was talking, shared with the group that he would argue that our moral imagination as physicians should extend beyond considerations related solely to research. As an example, the fact that racial disparities in outcomes of almost every disease can be attributed to unequal access to healthcare is well documented. This is brought up by Aaron earlier as well. Such disparities in health outcomes are much less in every country in the world that has free or mostly free national health care. Therefore, I believe we as physicians have a responsibility to advocate for a national healthcare system that provides equal access to all, to take this position to be on the right side of history. And Howard Saft, which I will be reading out loud, and I'm sorry, I did not get to process this before sharing with everyone, but Howard Saft fully agrees with Dr. Tobin that's harder than an outsider often thinks. Oftentimes people commit years of their life to become a researcher, and their scientist status is based on whether or not they receive funding. Sometimes the deeper you get into such circles and bubbles, the easier it is to accept such things. They often are not as obvious as they were in the Tuskegee experiments. What I saw in the policy health services research realm was the more that people moved up the ranks in policy research, the less they saw in the policy health, the less they saw and appreciated the people that were impacted by that research. It's not as obvious and can be a slow process, being nudged in a direction slowly into moving ethical limits. Thinking through these things before starting a research career can be important. So I think that's very poignant and goes right back to what Dr. Tobin was saying.
As I've been thinking about that idea, one question I have for our panelists, and just looking at time, this may be among our last questions. It's just, Dr. Tobin in the paper left us, and just now again left us with this thought that all of the higher education was not enough for many participants to act atrociously, and as many folks have mentioned in the chat, there really is a separation between the kind of level of training you have or the kind of training you have and just your acts, your acts and your ability to question yourself and be courageous and think through this idea with moral imagination. So instead, in the paper, Dr. Tobin advocated for, the courage to speak, the willpower to act. And again, just thinking of our trainees, again, this seems so apt for them because by definition, they're still in this somewhat educational phase of medicine, though they may themselves have plenty of other training and education elsewhere. And so how do they take the role of speaking courageously and acting, right? How do our trainees take on this role of speaking courageously and acting when necessary? And one thought that comes to mind is, it's been our trainees who have really pushed us to consider, race-based corrections in PFTs or, with EGFR and all these things. Is that a version of them acting courageously? How else do they do that? And this is a question for our panelists, but of course, our chat.
And maybe we could do it in, just for the sake of time, let's make sure that we hear from all of our panelists, and then we'll see what we can do about follow-up questions from the group. So if Aaron, do you want to start with that?
Sure thing. I think that the example you brought up about race-based algorithms in medicine is an excellent example. What I would point out is that those young trainees that are leading that charge are still, largely not socialized into medicine, right? So they're responding as, to some extent, as members of the general public still, right? And so, yes, we need to create safe spaces and allow for people to speak up, make it easier for them, and more people will be inclined to do it. That is, require less courage, and you'll have more courageous people. But two, again, I'd focus on what is their idea of being a physician? Does it incorporate those ideas of advocacy, speaking up when they see things wrong, and also does it allow them to stay connected to the reasonable values that they already have, right? And integrate those with medical ethics rather than have them replaced or displaced, right? I think those are very important points.
Nitin, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I honestly, in the interest, I would echo what Aaron's saying, and honestly, I'm looking at the chat because I think the chat has been remarkable and instructive. That's right. I think as groups are leaders, we have to create a safe space. We have to role model advocacy. I'm just echoing what they're saying in the chat, and then really put our trainees in the position to take that lead. And I think that's flattening that hierarchies and emphasizing that culture, doing that every day. Those are critical aspects from my point of view.
For the trainees, I believe the Tuskegee story is very powerful because you can identify with the various people that are in it. It's like a novel that you can see the characters in it. And I think there's none of us that are going to be Peter Buxtons. That is, the bar is way too high to think that the next person is going to be another Peter Buxton. But all of us can avoid being Walter Edmondson. And that is a very low bar. And that is the bar we need to make sure that we don't go below.
Great. And it looks like in the chat, others are echoing that we continue to learn from history. And really in real time, the racism that exists in our society now, and calling that out and trying to find that courage to call it out in our own communities with whichever version of that community that is. And Christine, did I miss other things, similar kind of stories about creating safe space for trainees?
Yeah, exactly. I think everyone's on the same page here, which is really nice to hear, and empowering and inspiring, and a good reminder for us moving forward. Hugo, I'll turn this back over to you, but I did want to encourage everyone. This is a topic that we can continue to talk about for much more than an hour allows us to. So when we send out a survey about the webinar afterwards, we'll put in a link or a contact information if you have further questions or discussion points, anything that was kind of stirred by this webinar that you didn't feel comfortable addressing in a big group, or we didn't have the time to do it. Please address that. Based on this, we'll figure out what is the best format for a follow-up to the session. Okay, so just keep a lookout for your follow-up email to the webinar. Hugo, I'll turn this back to you.
No, thanks, Christine. With that, I want to just acknowledge again all of the people who helped us put this together. I want to thank our panelists, Doctors Tobin, Seaman, and Baugh, and thank you so much to all of the participants who helped kind of generate an important discussion that hopefully we continue in our own communities. I'll acknowledge that a lot of what we mentioned was challenging, and there weren't easy solutions, and a lot of it came back to finding courage within ourselves and then trying to help support our community members to continue that. And that can be a hard thing at times. So I thank you all for that discussion. I thank the panelists. Thank you, Christine, for your co-hosting with me. And thanks everyone. You all have a good day.